Hello YouTube and welcome to my channel. My name's Kevin and I have just completed a degree in political science and economics. I created this channel as a way to respond to political and economic events in the world, and I've basically been following politics for, well, now about 10 years or so, since I just gone into entering high school. And so I've finally created a channel as a way to kind of put my thoughts and views out there with respect to politics and economics. As the name of the channel Superpower suggests, this channel is primarily focused around geopolitics and issues related to international relations from a political as well as an economic perspective. So that kind of leads me into basically what this channel is going to be about and my background. So basically one of the primary motivations that led me to making a channel about these issues is that I've myself kind of come around to having a political and worldview that's basically summarized as liberalism. And so I see a lot of hypocrisy and double standards in the liberal community out there. And that was one of the motivations I had in starting this channel, was to hopefully resolve some of these contradictions and raise awareness surrounding them. The issue of cognitive dissonance was one of the primary factors that led me to finally go through and create a political channel. I feel that cognitive dissonance is one of the most important and unfortunate sort of psychological consequences of a lot of these political contradictions that are currently abundant in the political discourse. So, for example, one of these that this channel is going to be primarily centered around is, as it relates to international relations, the issues of sovereignty and the sort of Westphalian world order versus a way of viewing the world that conceptualizes things such as human rights and dignity as universal and moral universalism, in contrast to moral relativism and Westphalianism, which basically holds that sovereignty is this sort of absolute, paramount sort of idol and is ultimately sacred. And so a lot of mainstream liberalism has ironically adopted a very outmoded Westphalian way of looking at the world, which ultimately I basically reduce to basically having two primary components, which is ultimately human rights for whites and to hell with everyone else. And this manifests itself in isolationism, which is ascendant on the right and the left. A number of liberals have adopted an isolationist worldview, even though historically in the last 30 or 40 years isolationism is primarily within a Western, especially American context, being comprised of mostly paleo-conservatives, a lot of libertarian, very sort of far right, sort of just religious to the level of ethnic nationalism. That sort of subset of the population has subscribed to isolationism, but isolationism has really become popular in left-wing spheres as well. And a lot of people who call themselves liberals have adopted an isolationist perspective when it relates to world affairs. And so for me, my sort of way of looking at the world is, and I'll go into this in more detail in another video, but I position myself somewhere between a liberal hawk and a neoconservative when it comes to international international relations and my worldview with respect to the international system. And I distinguish myself from liberal hawks in the sense that a lot of liberal hawks are primarily concerned with issues solely pertaining to humanitarianism and human rights, which is good, and I have a very large overlap of common interest and common moral values with the liberal hawk community, but the liberal hawkism discounts to some extent the national security interest and prioritization of national security threats, and so that's where I have a lot more overlap with the neoconservative perspective, which is that I feel that in order to have a successful and sustainable humanitarian foreign policy, you have to have a secure and continuous state system in the United States and the Western Hemisphere. And so even though, for example, Venezuela constitutes currently a greater humanitarian threat, or greater humanitarian crisis from a solely human impact perspective, right now, I feel that Iran is a higher priority to be dealt with because their regime is currently trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons. And that poses an existential threat, not just to the United States, but to the allies of the free world, such as Israel. And so ultimately, Iran is a bigger impediment to a sustainable humanitarian foreign policy because their dictatorship will pose an existential threat to the United States and NATO, as well as Israel, if they manage to successfully acquire nuclear weapons, which if things go the way that they're currently going in the world, they definitely will. And North Korea, far poorer and less technologically capable country, has already proven that if you put your mind to it and you bluff your way and BS your way through negotiations, you can fool the world and you can get those fissile materials enriched to a sufficient level to build a working nuclear weapon in just a matter of years underground. And there's no verification process. There's no way to ultimately stop that without resorting to military action, which will be costly in the short run, but ultimately in the grand scheme of things, far, far less deadly and less damaging than if we wait for the Ayatollah to acquire nuclear weapons and use them against Israel as well as U.S. bases in the region, which is their stated goal. I mean, when you go back to 2009, President of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, had stated that it was the goal of the Islamic Republic of Iran to annihilate Israel, and he was referring, of course, to nuclear weapons. He had done a number of tours of their centrifuge facilities and had basically almost gone to the Kim Jong-il level of, we're going to get nukes, what are you going to do about it? And of course, the United States did nothing about it back then, and they continue to do nothing except the pulling out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or as I call the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Inaction, by the Trump administration. One of the only areas of agreement I have with the Donald Trump administration. That ultimately has at least signaled a moral opposition to the Iranian nuclear crisis, but I don't think he's going to do anything about it because Iran's friends with Russia and he owes a lot of money to Russia. But, so that's kind of my foreign policy perspective, is I ultimately lie somewhere between a liberal hawk and a neoconservative, but I distinguish myself from the neoconservatives because I have a more secular, less religious way of seeing the world, and I don't subscribe to a lot of the conservative social values that a lot of modern-day neoconservatives do, even though it is worth pointing out that neoconservatism ultimately started with liberals that were disillusioned with their fellow colleagues on the left dusting the portraits of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong and singing praise of dictators. And so neoconservatism initially and to some extent still is a liberal ideology and a liberal way of seeing the world, but it's a lot more sort of focused on securitization and a lot more focused on the direct national interest, whereas I have a much more sort of global way of seeing the world. I want the world to eventually become a global single Western-style democracy, or at least a Western-style democratic federation, somewhat like the European Union. I am opposed in this respect to the United Nations, which I see as a compromise between it's an objective fact that it has been a compromise between good and evil since 1945, when the organization was founded on the concessions to Joseph Stalin in order to secure Soviet support. I don't believe that there's any value in having an organization such as that, especially if that's the only primary big sort of international organization out there that is seen as legitimate and whatnot. I much more see NATO, and I wish that NATO were enlarged, but I see multilateral action by Western democracies as the ultimate sort of objective in terms of trying to get support for taking action on something. I don't care what the Communist Party of China or the fascist government of Russia has to say about whether or not the West should stop genociding Yugoslavia or take out a tyrant in Iraq or take out an eventual but very real nuclear threat in Iran and North Korea. I don't care what they have to say, to be honest, and so I see the UN as a ultimate compromise between good and evil. And so and I talk about globalization and globalism. I'm not talking about the United Nations, as people like Alex Jones and whatnot would characterize globalism as being. I'm talking about global universal liberal democracy. That's what I see as globalism as being the end goal, with it, or at least a more integrated federation like the European Union with free trade and human rights for every citizen. And so that's kind of my foreign policy perspective. This channel is going to be quite focused on foreign policy and international relations, but I'm going to be talking about other political and economic issues as well. So I'm going to get into my other views with respect to politics and economics. So when it comes to social views, I identify as a liberal. I basically see individualism and the right to live one's truth as one of the paramount and fundamental sort of bases for the social fabric of a successful and prosperous society. I don't believe in things like tradition for the sake of tradition. I don't believe in this sort of idea of what's the term? I don't believe in racial chauvinism. A lot of the sort of traditionally conservative, social conservative, paleoconservative ways of seeing the world. When it comes to economics, I identify as a liberal as well. So I believe in free market capitalism, but where I stand apart from libertarians, and I have a number of major contentions with libertarians, which I'll get into in the future, but one of the primary distinguishing factors that separates me from libertarianism is that I believe in a regulated market where the government's role is to prevent market failures and subsidize positive externalities and tax negative externalities. So as an example of a market failure, you could look at, say, for example, a more extreme one would be the fire department, where if you only have private fire insurance, then if somebody's uninsured or has insurance with a different corporation, if one company's fire trucks are coming to deal with a house that's on fire, and catches to another house, but they only put out the primary house where it started, that fire is going to burn down an entire city, basically. That's the logical conclusion of that. And so the market failure in this case is that the market, if left to its own devices, produces an inefficient outcome where government intervention, in the case of just nationalizing the fire industry, the firefighting industry, actually produces a more optimal and efficient outcome than the free market would. Now, most industries, almost all of them, I don't see as being characterized by such a profound market failure that they necessitate a nationalization, whereas a lot of socialists see it in the other area, where they'll see it as either all or almost all the industries should be nationalized, such as the railway, for example, which I don't believe in. I don't believe that should be a nationalized industry. In terms of negative externalities, pollution's the primary one that comes to mind. I think it's the government's role to regulate and tax pollution. I think that the market, if left of its own, will create such a negative externality that it results in such a high loss in social surplus that it doesn't make sense to leave it to its own devices, because pollution ultimately affects everybody. And so that's another one of those areas where I believe that the government has a role to intervene in terms of regulation and taxation. And then finally, in terms of the positive externalities, one of the big ones that comes to mind is new industries that pose great advances for society, such as the solar industry, for example, but don't have enough upstart capital to provide for sort of a viable alternative to the existing status quo, which ultimately reduces the social surplus. And so in that case, there's an argument to be made that subsidies actually work. Now, an example of this is the oil industry back in the late 19th, early 20th century, where the governments of the West would subsidize the oil industry because a lot of these companies didn't have the necessary capital to become viable producers and actually bring their stuff to market in such a level that it could improve society. A lot of the renewable industry sector is in a similar position today in the last decade or so. So I kind of see them as being the equivalent of the gas sector back in the gas and oil back in the late 19th, early 20th century, where there's an argument to be made that subsidies are ultimately going to provide more social surplus than waiting 30 or 40 years for the market to eventually deliver to the point where they become competitive. I think that there's a case to be made that that the government has a role in not directing, but providing some assistance to speed things up, especially when there is a negative externality as it relates to pollution with the alternatives such as coal right now. So that's kind of my economic outlook. I'm an economic liberal, but I believe in a regulated economy. But as I mentioned before, I don't see many industries as having such a profound market failure issue that they necessitate being entirely managed by the government. So that's one of the major areas that distinguishes me from, say, social democrats on the one hand, where they'll also have a capitalistic way of viewing the world, but they believe that a lot more should be operated by government bureaucracy. Whereas for me, I kind of see it as that should be avoided in cases except where the market failure is so bad that it empirically debilitates society to have it be managed by the free market, such as firefighting or police or the military. So I'm against mercenaries, for example. I know that's one of those areas where some neoconservatives have kind of come around to the idea of mercenaries, but I go back to what Niccolo Machiavelli had talked about. I mean, 500 years ago he was onto this. He's like, in peacetime, mercenaries will command a premium and take your money, but in war, they'll either run for the hills or they'll take more money from your enemy, and they'll ultimately do you in, even though they were in your employment all that time during peacetime. So I'm not down with mercenaries. And a great example of this you can see with Blackwater, the CEO and founder of Blackwater, Eric Prince. He went to a meeting in the Seychelles with representatives of the government of fascist Russia. So if you're the leader of one of the major mercenary corporations of the United States, and you're compromised where you might be acting on the interests of fascist Russia or communist China, we got a problem there. And that's why I'm for a national military. I don't believe in mercenaries or anything. So that's an area of profound, not just market failure in that case, but moral failure and defense compromisation, where the entire integrity of your national security is undermined if you allow for private military contractors to basically be allowed to have contacts, be allowed to have dinners with representatives of foreign hostile governments. And so that's where it relates to my economic and foreign policy sort of perspective, where there's some overlap there. So I got the social, I got the foreign policy metric, and I got the economic spectrum down. The only other sort of area around my worldview is that when I look at the world and I see a lot of politics, I see ultimately the ascension of populism right now, where there's this sort of dichotomy between the populists and the establishment, so to speak, and I am honestly disgusted by that. That was one of the major factors that led me to create this channel. I'm disgusted by the ascension of populism. I mean, you see it with everybody from Donny Yesser, Vladimir Trump in the United States, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to you got the fascist Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. You got basically, and those are just the ones that are in power. You have others vying for power right now, such as crazy tanky Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. You got Bernie the Fool Sanders in the United States. You got Kremlin shill Jill Stein in the United States, leading the Green Party. You got a lot of populist champions right now that are basically running on this what's kind of branded as a popular agenda, but in reality it results in consolidation of power around one strongman, in essence, where in the end it overlaps between the left and the right, where they basically become indistinguishable, right? It's basically, you take all the worst and most vulgar aspects of the left wing, and you couple that with all the worst and the most vulgar aspects of the right wing, the dog whistling, the racial chauvinism, basically the victim mentality of the sort of uneducated white working male, this sort of basis of this sort of neo-FDR public works sort of program that has a lot of sympathy and historical precedent in Joseph Stalin, where FDR himself was a great admirer and very, very much friendly with Joseph Stalin. And then you have the modern day equivalent of Donald Trump writing, as he said, beautiful love letters to quote unquote Chairman Kim, or as I call him, Fatty Commie Kimmy. I mean, you're the president of the United States, you're the nominal leader of the free world, and you're going around referring to the fat despot as Chairman Kim when his dynasty has killed 5 million people since 1948. Just unbelievable. And so you have this unholy alliance, if you will, between people such as Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, where it's ultimately rests on basically this profound sort of vulgarity, this appeal to the bottom of the barrel of society, where instead of trying to create a system in which people can become, independent and ultimately become prosperous and grow, you have this mentality that says, oh no, you're actually right to be resentful that it's not the 1950s anymore. You're actually right to be resentful that women have rights now. You're right to be resentful that especially from the right wing, what they'll say is, the Jews send everybody to die for their wars. That's an example that they use a lot. There's a lot of race baiting against people like George Soros, for example. A lot of anti-Semitism on both sides. In the United States, not so much, but in the United Kingdom in particular, where the left wing has a profound anti-Semitic element to it, where there's a lot of anti-Jewish dog whistling that goes on there, and some of it's very explicit. There's an agreement on both sides that capitalism's bad, that public works for the sake of public works are really good. There's this fetishization of the labor value, or the labor theory of value, which essentially is a sort of Marxist notion that says, well, you can determine the value of something by how much effort was put into it. And of course, Milton Friedman, a number of economists have totally busted the idea of the labor theory of value, because an example of why the labor theory of value is bunk is if you dig a hole and you spend 10 hours digging the hole and you spend 3 hours filling it back in, you just work 13 hours and you work hard. If you're using a shovel and everything, old school digging. And so is that actually going to be worth as much as, say, somebody else who might be making a website or something for 13 hours that gets, say, 80 million viewers? Well, no, the person who spent the 13 hours making the website, even though they did less physical work, they created a lot more value in the economy than the dude who just spent 13 hours digging a hole and filling it back in. But the populace, they fetishize the labor theory of value. And so, and a lot of Marxist sort of economics, where you have people that run the gamut of the political spectrum, from Tucker Carlson, who, he argues against automation, he argues against innovation, he argues that, in essence, that the United States should go back to the 1940s, FDR, public works, etc. And then you have the people on the left, such as Bernie Sanders or crazy tanky Jeremy Corbyn, where there's this sort of idea that, well, we should nationalize all the industries and then just hire people to run routes such as the railways in the United Kingdom that have almost no demand for them. And then the service isn't going to be that great. But we're going to give people jobs as if that's somehow going to make society more prosperous. So one of my backgrounds in economics is in cost-benefit analysis. And so one of the big misconceptions that you see around with the news and everything is that creating jobs is kind of like a goal in and of itself, even though at the end of the day, if you're creating new jobs, that's actually, if you're the government, that's a cost to society, because people are going to be working, whether it's in the private sector or in the government sector. So if the government creates some random project that doesn't have that much use just to create jobs, but say they create 50,000 jobs, well, the politicians get a lot of credit, the newspaper praises them, everybody sings praise. But in reality, those 50,000 people could have been more productive doing a number of different things. You have to look at it in terms of the opportunity cost. They may have been able to make more money somewhere else. What could have been much more efficient way is if the government subsidized their travel expenses to go and work somewhere else for, say, a private firm. But if they're getting paid a lot more money and they're more productive, then it makes no sense to do the public works projects. It helps facilitate the market to be more efficient, where people can get rich. It doesn't make any sense to kind of appeal to the bottom of the barrel and not. And this is one of the fundamentals of populism, is that it ultimately functions a lot like a welfare system, where nominally it claims to help the most disenfranchised elements of the population, but in reality all it does is keep them there, because you got to have voters for the next election that you can appeal with your strongman tactics to. So you're not actually doing anything to help a lot of people. You're ultimately using them as a political prop so that you can stay in power and they can stay destitute. So the welfare system is a great example, not from a populist perspective, but just from an economic analogous sort of strategy where you have people that are poor and they desperately need help. The government agrees to provide a social safety net and help them by giving them monthly payments so that they're not homeless. But then if they then decide, well, I want to get back on my feet and I want to go work, then the government garnishes up to 50% of their paycheck from their job. That's an example where it's not populist, but it's one of those strategies of keeping people basically as indentured, poverty-stricken individuals, where the next time the election comes around, you can campaign and say, oh yeah, we're going to help you and everything. You can have an established voter base. And oftentimes the people who are in that situation, they don't have the mental energy to be able to see through what's going on. I mean, when you're just trying to make ends meet, those are great people to take advantage of. And so these are tactics that are used in democracies to secure a voter base. But the analogy within dictatorships, such as North Korea, is where they'll go way more extreme. They'll starve their people, so starving people can't rise up. Well, in a democracy, people that are so stricken by poverty can't vote for anybody else either. They'll see you as the safeguard of whatever social safety net there is. And so I'm against welfare. I believe in a universal basic income. I believe in replacing the entire means-tested apparatus with a universal basic income system. And that way, there's no garnishment of wages if you decide that you want to make more money. There's no stigma. There's no, you have to go to some reporting center and prove that you're poor in order to get assistance. There's none of that. And the eventual goal is the eradication of poverty, right? Whereas with populism, that's not the eventual goal. The whole goal of populism is so that the great leader can buy his next swag yacht, basically. I mean, you look at Trump. What did he run on? He ran on. He was going to fight for the people of West Virginia. He's gonna fight for the common man, as he says it. And what does he do? He just resorts to the same old wedge issues, nonsensical, social conservative. Meaningless, talking points, such as you see on Fox News all the time about, the real problem is that women have rights or whatever, or the real problem is that, Israel is doing some shady stuff or whatever. The whole thing is, or George Soros is going to put you in a hobbit home, all that sort of stuff. Just this nonsense. Or, Gillette razors, oh, they're scary. We need a safe space from those. The whole thing is just choose the most inconsequential issue, focus on that, and then get reelected, but not actually help anybody at the end of the day. And so I'm against that. And then, of course, the left-wing equivalent will incorporate the welfare apparatus and the whole means-tested bureaucracy, which, as I argue, stigmatizes people who are poor and also functions to keep them poor. Whereas the universal basic income system would be initially very empowering, but down the road, just kind of a normal thing that kind of, you just kind of see as a part and parcel of being a citizen. When there's no more poverty, universal basic income will function more as a social safety net for entrepreneurship and to spur innovation. It won't be this sort of crutch that welfare is, where there's such a massive amount of relative poverty where you have to have alleviation of that. But as I mentioned, a universal basic income system down the road would basically spur innovation to the point where there wouldn't be that level of poverty, where people would be encouraged on an individual but as well as a national level to enrich themselves and as a country grow more prosperous. With the populist movement, you also as well have this dictator apologia that is coupled with the isolationism, and so that's one of the primary factors that led me to create this channel. is just a disgust with the hypocrisy, especially on the left. It's not so much a hypocrisy from, say, paleo-conservatives or ethno-nationalists, because their whole game is isolationism. Their whole game is, human rights for whites, to hell with everyone else. But to see people that call themselves liberal or to call themselves progressive, dusting the portraits and singing the praises of people like Bashar al-Assad, total war criminal, or KGB Vlad in Russia, who executes and tortures gay people, just a disgrace. And so again, when it relates to cognitive dissonance, that was one of the primary factors that led me to create this channel, is that I want to clear out a lot of the cognitive dissonance that's out there. I, in the past, have suffered from cognitive dissonance when I was sorting out my political views. I've always had a very sort of consistent framework when it relates to social liberalism and whatnot, but the issue is that going to university and everything, being friends with a lot of people who don't share those views and everything, you kind of have to come in slowly and whatnot. And now that I've graduated from university, it's a lot easier to just kind of be myself and live according to my own truth politically. But when all your professors, or the vast majority of your professors, are isolationists and come at things from a very sort of staunchly anti-human interventionist perspective, a very sort of, as I would argue, Westphalian absolute sovereignty fetishist perspective, where sovereignty is sort of this end-all be-all in the world, and it's imperialist for the United States to do anything about human rights abuses in the world. You just functioning in that system. I learned to play devil's advocate a lot, but there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that arises if you play devil's advocate too much. Now, of course, I think that playing devil's advocate is actually a really good mental exercise, and I do it a lot, and I still find that that's one of the best ways to sort of keep your ideas in check and to kind of run through thought experiments. But when you're living basically your academic life as playing devil's advocate and whatnot, just so that you can do well in classes and everything and not kind of be totally ostracized, it's just it's not that great. It's not that great psychologically. And I in the last year or so have just learned, I don't care how many friends I lose for holding to my own political views and whatnot, because at the end of the day, moral universalism is a universalist thing, and I don't feel that I have any regrets in terms of basically adopting 100% consistent political viewpoint, regardless of its popularity. And so, because the popularity of an issue doesn't, or of a perspective on an issue doesn't equal the correctness of that perspective. And I feel that when it comes to a lot of political issues, generally speaking, I feel that people's minds can be changed if you synthesize the contradictions of their worldview. And my hope with this channel is to not necessarily outright just change people's minds, but to lead mostly progressives, mostly liberals, but also a lot of conservatives that are also disillusioned with the paleo-conservative angle of the conservative movement, to kind of realize their contradictions and to hopefully synthesize them in a way where once they're resolved, they'll have a more consistent worldview. Now that worldview can go either way, of course. You could embrace your isolationism and your dictator apologia by arguing, for example, that we should have a fascist dictator in the United States, in Canada, and the United Kingdom. That would be a morally consistent and non-cognitive dissonance inducing political perspective, though I would disagree with it 100%, of course. But if you're a fascist in the United States, in Canada, and the United Kingdom, many of the Western countries, and you're doing apologia for, say, Putin or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un or Bashar al-Assad, well, there's not that much of a contradiction there, because you also want a strongman authoritarian dictator here. That's a very sort of consistent and very consistently logical, though not correct, worldview, as I see it morally, but it is psychologically consistent, and that would reduce cognitive dissonance. Of course, the other way, the way that I'm ideally hoping to lead people to adopt, is morally consistent liberal worldview, which is basically realizing that isolationism, the idea of human rights for whites to hell with everyone else, is not consistent with a progressive or liberal agenda. That if you are progressive or liberal, the only logical foreign policy and international relations perspectives for you that will not induce cognitive dissonance are liberal hawkism or neoconservatism. Because if you are, say, for example, championing gay rights in, hypothetically, France, but you're doing apologia for Hamas, Assad, and Putin, well, I got news. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on there. Now, you might not realize it, but one day you're going to be like, and I'm sure a lot of people subconsciously are to some extent aware of the contradiction, realize that, actually, this is kind of awkward. Of course, if all your friends who are progressive are also isolationists, and they also watch Russia Today or Democracy Now!, as I call it, Hypocrisy Now!, or Telesur, Al Jazeera, any of these fascist / socialist, authoritarian sponsored state TV outlets that basically teach you that the United States is this imperialist evil, but Russia's totally right to annex Crimea and actually create an empire. That, if all your friends don't see the contradiction there, then you might be able to go a few years without suffering from cognitive dissonance. But what I want to do with this channel is get you to question those contradictions and work through a synthesized resolution where you have a resolved, moral, universalist, consistent perspective on the world. That will help you psychologically, but it will also ultimately help politically, because it will it'll sort of set the battle lines between consistent and genuine actors, and rid out the disingenuous, rid out the clueless, the useful idiots in the world. And hopefully, as I argue, hopefully a lot of people that come to that synthesis will go into a liberal direction and ultimately realize that things such as neoliberalism, liberal hawkism are really morally consistent with progressivism and liberalism as it relates to social views. That if you care about, say, for example, gay rights in France, but you don't care about gay rights in Syria or Russia, well, then you're basically conceding that gay rights don't actually have any value, because if they don't matter there, then eventually that moral degradation and that moral duplicitousness is going to result in them not mattering here either, right? I mean, take, for example, democracy. If you say, it's relative, we should be a democracy here and we should have human rights here, but, to hell with the Syrians, or to hell with the Russian people, or, screw the North Korean people. Well, eventually that moral recklessness, that's going to seep through the moral fabric of Western countries as well. And one day you might wake up in fascism here and be like, wait, I didn't sign up for this. And what are you going to get? Well, you're going to get the secret police telling you, hey, look, do you want to be a fifth column enemy of the state? I mean, there is no universal value to democracy. So if there's no universal value to democracy, then what value does it have here? Why does it only not matter there? So, again, as I mentioned, there are basically two directions that this can go when you work through those cognitive dissonance and contradictions. You either go full fash or you go full liberal. you can't be progressive in the West and argue for gay rights in the West and then go around supporting Hamas or go around supporting Palestinian Authority. You can't go around supporting the Iranian Ayatollah. You can't go around supporting Vladimir Putin as people such as apologists like Glenn Greenwald will do, where he'll be against, and I'll talk about this more in a later video, but he'll talk against Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and his crackdown on homosexuals in Brazil, but then call Putin the victim of Western liberal aggression and NATO expansionism. That's not morally consistent. That's not morally consistent at all, because you're basically saying, I care about gay rights in Brazil, but to hell with the Russians, and the gays in Russia can go, they can go to a labor camp or get executed. That's not a morally consistent framework. And in the case of Glenn Greenwald, it's particularly disingenuous because he's an educated person, and so he comes across as either very much a problematic, useful idiot, or basically a Russian asset at that point. And so I'm trying to, with this channel, not just cover the news, not just offer my perspective on world affairs and economic affairs, but to reach out to people that I do have disagreements with, and to people that will watch these videos and have a visceral reaction that will lead them to say, I'm downvoting this guy because he's, a no-good neocon or whatnot. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just asking for people to resolve themselves so we can tell which side people are on, right? Because we're in a world right now where the disinformation campaigns coming out of fascist Russia and communist China are just so profoundly undermining of the Western social fabric, because we're susceptible and vulnerable to these disinformation campaigns. They're not. They can foster extremism and sponsor far-right neo-Nazis here at the same time as sponsoring far-left Chapo Trap House watching vulgar leftist populists, so that they can radicalize the political discourse and undermine us. But we can't do the same to them, because they don't have a democracy. If we all of a sudden fund a bunch of, memes or whatever to go out to fascist Russia or to communist China so that people can start to question Putin, say, for example, well, you can question Putin all you want. It's not going to do anything because they rig their own elections, right? It's like if we try to rig things to get things to a more balanced and democratic method, sort of equilibrium over there, well, it's not going to do any good because they rig their elections. Well, they don't even really have elections in China. They have a quote-unquote centralized democracy, which basically means whatever Xi Jinping says goes. Peace be upon Xi Jinping. Let's dust the portraits of the great leader. That's their form of democracy. That there's not that much way of undermining them, which even if we could, we haven't been spending any money on cyber warfare defense, not to the same percentage that these countries have, because they know our weakness. They know how to undermine democracy. And I believe in democracy, but I'll be the first one to admit that democracy is a lot harder to maintain than a dictatorship is. If you're trying to maintain a dictatorship is fragile, but it is easy to maintain. You just have to starve the people enough, close off enough information, and have enough secret police and enough incentives where people will inform on people for doing things even if they haven't even done anything, which will create such a level of fear that you basically have a sustainable Stalinist system. Though it's fragile because when the dictator dies, then it becomes a total calamity. You can watch The Death of Stalin to see how that goes. It's just in terms of stability. Dictatorships are only stable and sustainable while that current dictator is alive. North Korea has done an interesting experiment where they've mixed monarchy with fascism. That's an interesting communist fascism. That's an interesting way of doing it. But like I said, I'll be the first to admit, democracy is a lot harder. It needs constant revitalization. It needs an educated electorate. And it needs people that are on guard so that we can protect ourselves from the connivances of our enemies. And the primary enemies today are fascist Russia and communist China. And when we have such an extreme political discourse today, with the ascension of populism and the appealing to the bottom of the barrel, the racial chauvinism, the dog whistling, etc., when you have this radicalized political discourse, it becomes a lot easier to undermine the democratic process in the Western countries. And it's a smart tactic on the part of our enemies, because they know, in particular fascist Russia knows, that if it came down to a conventional or even a nuclear war, but that's a topic for a different video, on bipolarity and mutual assured destruction, they would lose. They would lose huge. The Russian military, the Russian Navy is weaker than the Navy of Italy, and Italy isn't even the top 3 navies in NATO, and all NATO would be united against Russia. So they know that they can't win on a military front, but where they can win is if they resort to mimetic and cyber warfare, to the point where they can play to the contradictions and cognitive dissonances within the Western democracies, within a lot of the electorate, and radicalize them to the point such that illiberal authoritarianism is a synthesis that results. And I believe that it is incumbent upon people in the media and in journalism to ultimately try to counteract this, and because it's not a military war, it's a Cold War, and the only way that we win this is to be aware as a population of our own biases and cognitive dissonances and contradictions, and try to do our best for personal growth, psychological well-being, and try to foster prosperity. And so that's one of the aims of this channel, is to counteract the moral degradation within society. And again, I come at this from a liberal point of view. I don't believe in the Abrahamic organized religions and whatnot. When I talk about moral universalism, I'm talking about human dignity, human rights, the idea that the government should be held accountable, the idea of checks and balances, the idea of rule of law, the idea of liberal values, the idea that capitalism anywhere in the world works just as well as the law of gravity works anywhere in the world. It is a universal fact and empirically proven that liberal capitalism provides the most prosperous growth for the most average people of any system of economics experimented with in history, and that if the Estonian people try it, it works. If the South Korean people try it, it works. Wherever. It doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter what your coordinates are, it doesn't matter if you're 46 degrees north, 22 degrees west, it doesn't matter if you're 122 degrees east, 61 degrees south. Capitalism, gravity, they're still just as true. You can't jump off a cliff at one of those coordinates and expect to be fine 500 meters below, and then jump off a cliff at another and expect to die. No, you're going to die at both, because the gravity is roughly going to be about 9.8 meters per second squared in either case. Likewise, laws of capitalism, supply and demand, same in both cases. The human nature is a universal thing, and so it doesn't make sense that white people, mostly in the West, should have human rights, but Russians and North Koreans shouldn't. That's not a morally universalist. That's a moral, well, I would argue it's a morally depraved way of seeing the world, but it's a moral relativistic way of seeing the world. I argue that moral relativism is basically one of the biggest threats to a democracy, because it inspires people who are susceptible to the devil's advocate way of thinking to get into a groupthink dynamic where if enough people all play devil's advocate for fascism at the same time, well, then you can't really stop playing it anymore, because you've already got your fascist great leader in place. And if you all of a sudden decide, hey guys, I'm out, well, now the secret police are coming for you, So, I mean, it ain't a game. This is a very fragile system we have in the West, though it is less fragile and more sustainable and more prosperous than dictatorships when they come to succession crises. But it is still somewhat fragile, and it requires enough self-awareness to maintain, where if we abandon and succumb to short-term memory, and forget how World War II ended, and forget, how fascism and communism have gone in the last century, then we're basically condemned to have the same things be our blight in this century. And so with this channel, that's one of my primary aims, is to try to ward off cognitive dissonance, moral depravity, populism, authoritarianism, dictator apologia, fascism, and of course, ultimately get people that I do have nominal disagreements today to realize their contradictions, and hopefully we'll have more agreements in the future. Hopefully a lot of progressives and liberal-minded people will realize that it makes no sense to vote for people like Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, who praise and defend Assad, that the idea of peace and Westphalian sovereignty isn't some great fetish to basically celebrate. It's actually very bad and very morally depraved, and ultimately induces a level of cognitive dissonance that's not good for you, because that sort of thing stays with you. And even though you might not be consciously aware of it all the time, when you go to sleep and you start thinking as you lie there in bed about the world and what you believe about things and why you feel the way you do, well, I can tell you, if you are championing, if you're spending your daytime hours going to things like protests for, say, women's rights, gay rights, etc., and then you're also going on social media and talking about how MSNBC or CNN are fake news, and they're supporting a war agenda or whatnot by making Assad look bad. Well, I got news for you. Assad's bad. They don't need to make him look bad. He was bad the day he rose to power, the day Hafez al-Assad took power, the day whether or not he gassed those people, he still killed about 500,000 Syrians, and so with conventional means. So, not to mention, ultra-conservative, nationalist, Ba'athist, socialist, fascist, patriarchal dictatorship. That's what you're gonna do. You're gonna go and shill for those guys. So I'm gonna try basically with this channel. A few of the primary people on YouTube that really motivated me to get out here, because I don't necessarily want to be out here. I got other things that I could be doing. I write in my free time. I do a lot of writing. I got books that I'm trying to get published. I could be doing that, but I gotta basically, I feel it's to some extent my duty, because I'm aware of it now, to counteract the cognitive dissonance and moral degradation that people such as Kyle, as I call him, useful idiot Kulinski, have stoked, where he does the whole populist bandwagon, Putin's the victim of Western liberalism, the whole Glenn Greenwald package, the whole, USA bad, Russia good dynamic, to an even greater extent, though arguably less of a following, though more radical. Jimmy Dore, he's a Putin apologist. He never saw a dictator abroad that he didn't love. He likes to say that neoconservatives and liberal hawks, such as the great maverick John McCain, quote unquote, they never saw a war they didn't love. Well, I got news. War is hell, but so is communism and fascism. War is a temporary investment in peace, because the war happens no matter what, whether we wait for them to start it or we do it proactively. A preemptive war is against the dictatorship is just a defensive war, such as with Iran. Because if we wait 10 years for Iran to get nukes and then they nuke Israel, guess what? We have to fight that war no matter what. But instead of 30,000 people dying today, maybe 1.5 million Israeli civilians die, 400,000 Americans die, Not to mention the Americans that would die in the initial strikes on the U.S. bases in the region. I mean, I believe in a proactive foreign policy. I believe that the misnomer of proactive or preemptive war is just, it's a hack talking point, because all these wars, North Korea, for example, they are inevitably going to happen. And so if the West strikes first, guess what? They were going to strike no matter what. So that's actually a defensive action. That's not an offensive action, because dictatorships, especially revanchist, especially fascist dictatorships, especially dictatorships that mold their legitimacy on the idea of reunification, so to speak, where their whole stated goal is that they're going to take over South Korea eventually once they get enough nukes to probably deter America, so that the United States can't go over there and defend South Korea anymore like the United States did in the 1950s. Those guys are going to get war no matter what. So the war happens. The only question is how many casualties are there going to be. And I argue that liberal hawks and neoconservatives actually have the best interest of peace at mind, because the sooner we and the more proactively we conduct these liberations, the fewer people die and the less nukes our enemies are able to acquire. So that's actually disingenuous from Jimmy Dore's perspective. But Jimmy Dore, as I mentioned, he was one of the primary people. I've watched him in the past. When I went to university, I knew a number of people that watched him, almost religiously. I watched him actually, in the past I used to think some of his comedy was funny, but, as I mentioned, I've solidified and crystallized my political viewpoint. And I see him for what he is today. He calls himself a progressive, but in my view, there's nothing progressive about the idea of human rights for whites and hell with everyone else. He never saw a dictator he didn't love. He says John McCain never met a war he didn't love. Well, Jimmy Dore never met a dictator he didn't love. And I would argue that's a hell of a lot worse, because John McCain never loved war. His whole point was, the sooner you do this, the fewer people die, which is correct. But in Jimmy Dore's world, you don't do the war, or you wait for them to do the war and then you surrender to them, I guess, or you hand over your allies to them, I guess. Bad move, but anyway, and that would compromise our own national security, even if you did only care about the United States or Canada or Britain or France or whatever country you happen to reside in. In Jimmy Dore's case, he happens to live in the United States. Even if you only cared about America, that's a dumb move. That's a dumb move strategically, to hand over every asset to your rivals as if they're not going to be on your shores eventually. I mean, come on, the guy's basically a living caricature. But in his case, he has a loyal fan base. Another sort of character, but a group of characters that inspired me to create this channel was, of course, Chapel Trap hosts. Anybody who watches them unironically, you seriously need to consider your worldview and work through some of those contradictions, because now I know a lot of the people that watch that program, a lot of those people do believe in the authoritarian sort of fascist socialist model of, strongman, patriarchal government, but some people don't. Some people just like them because maybe they're disillusioned with, as they see it, the no good neocons or whatever. Well, why do you think the neocons are no good? Maybe you do see Putin as a victim. A lot of these people, I used to play devil's advocate and argue that the West broke promises to Russia and everything. Now I argue, well, the West should ultimately not even bother making a lot of these promises. The West should act multilaterally, but within countries that play by the same rules and have the same values. I feel that, so what? Because at the end of the day, breaking a promise about expanding NATO past West Germany is a hell of a lot of a less bad move to do than going full fascist in the case of Russia, where they literally, if you happen to live there and you happen to be anything other than complying with the hegemonic value, the hegemonic persona that the system allows you to be. In other words, if you're born male, you have to subscribe to every cultural characteristic that they state out for you, or if you're female, you have to abandon all hope of ever being independent and acquiesce to subservience for, you know, some random guy who's basically just going to take you for granted and everything. That whole model, that's a hell of a lot worse than anything NATO did. In my view, I don't care so much about who broke promises to whom. I care about the values under which the people in those hemispheres have to live. Guess what? You can live your truth for the most part in NATO. You can in Russia, unless your truth happens to be exactly consistent with whatever KGB Vlad says. Well, what kind of life is that? That's no life. That's a joke. And so that's mainly one of the primary motivations for starting this channel, is to transition the way of thinking in the West from sympathizing with people that we have wholehearted disagreements with just because maybe they were technically wrong according to some Westphalian notion of sovereignty, to understanding that, no, actually, you got to care about the people. You can't look at this from a state-to-state thing. You have to look at this from a human, a universalistic moral worldview. And the only ways that get synthesized are either you come around to liberal hawkism and neoconservatism, or you go in, say, you know, yeah, to hell with the Russians. We should have our own dictatorship here. We should be more like them. And again, this is mostly a problem from the liberal and progressive side, because many conservatives, a lot of paleo-conservatives do fully embrace Vladimir Putin. A lot of them are morally consistent. They say, yes, I like dictatorship abroad. I think that we should have a dictator here. A lot of them voted for Trump and said, yeah, I want him to become the God Emperor. I want him to tell me what to do. I can't wait to get up at 6 a.m. every morning and dust his portraits as the loudspeakers blare his voice, you know, saying how huge he is every day at 6 a.m. like they do in North Korea. You know, I love Fatty Commie Kim Jong-un. I'm glad that Vladimir Trump writes beautiful letters to him. I want to write beautiful letters to Kim. You know, that's a morally consistent outlook. So I'm trying to resolve people, because once these battle lines politically are resolved, we can clearly identify who's a fascist or who's an authoritarian socialist. And I believe fully that, especially within the West, but ultimately on a world level, that liberal capitalism will fully prevail, because we have empirical evidence on our side. We have the full opportunity for individual self-expression. We have everything on our side that allows people to be free. The only thing that the dictator apologia people and the isolationists have on their side are technical arguments about, oh, well, George H.W. Bush promised Boris Yeltsin that, or I guess it was Mikhail Gorbachev, that he wasn't going to expand NATO past West Germany, and then no good neocon Bill Clinton went and inducted Hungary and I believe it was Poland and I believe it was Hungary, Poland, and Romania, but I might be wrong about Romania, into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you know, that proves that Putin's actually the good guy and he's a victim of Western liberalism. And, you know, hashtag Glenn Greenwald, you know, hashtag, you know, populist resistance, whatever. You know, there's this whole idea that, you know, that's edgy and anti-establishment, even though I would argue that that's very pro-establishment. It's very pro-Russian establishment. It's very pro-establishment for every dictator. The only establishment, so to speak, that it's against is one of the least repressive establishments in the world, which is the United States, where you're able to live your life for the most part freely however you choose. You're able to date whomever you want. You're able to identify as whomever you want. You're able to live according to your own truth. You can't do that in Russia. If you try, guess what? They have gulags. They don't get so much attention now like they did back in the 50s and 60s, and nobody's writing any sort of Ivan Denisovich books about them anymore. And some of the people that will read those books will kind of say, oh, well, Putin's a victim or whatever, like a lot of the Jordan Peterson fanboys and stuff. They'll defend the current gulags. No, they still have labor camps. They sent the Pussy Riot women to labor camps for 2 years for protesting the Putin system. Unbelievable. Anyway, so these are all reasons basically underpinning the foundation of why I am creating this channel. Superpower aims to ultimately focus on not just reporting international news, but providing a morally consistent and moral universalist perspective from the liberal hawk and neoconservative camp with respect to international events as they unfold, as well as providing analysis and reporting on domestic and Western politics, as well as global economics, and covering human rights as it relates to its status in the world. And yes, so whether or not you agree or disagree with my views on any particular issue, I feel that you, by subscribing and following this channel, will hopefully be challenged intellectually and either evolve contradictions that you have to a synthesized resolution, or offer, a retort. I look forward to debate. I find that debates are generally pretty useful at resolving a lot of contradictions that both parties in the debate have. So yeah, basically this is the beginning. It's April 2019, and yeah, this is the mission of the channel, is to try to create a more psychologically well and politically consistent and morally consistent way of viewing the world. And so yeah, thank you for watching this, and hopefully we will be able to grow as a channel, and hopefully be able to have a sufficient amount of influence down the road, where a lot of these talking points that get taken for granted on channels such as Secular Talk or the Jimmy Dore Show or the Young Turks or Tucker Carlson viewers, Jordan Peterson viewers, Ben Shapiro viewers, the full gamut of isolationist channels, where there will be a greater sense of self-awareness, and I believe that we can have a productive debate and hopefully come to a broader social synthesis, to the point where we can see clearly who's on which side morally. And I believe that this will be healthy in terms of creating a more prosperous and lasting and sustainable liberal democracy in the West. Because the social dissonance, the moral relativism, the social division, the moral relativism, and the cognitive dissonance that has arisen, largely sponsored, but has been around organically, but largely sponsored by fascist Russia and to a lesser extent communist China within the last 15 or so years, but especially since about 2015. It's been very bad. It can be an existential threat in the same way as nuclear weapons, where they don't need to declare war on us. They can get us to destroy ourselves and get us to rot from within with cognitive dissonance, to the point that illiberal authoritarianism becomes the de facto way of governing in the West. It's already happened with Hungary. It's happening with Poland. They've tried to make it happen with Ukraine. They've resorted to military measures in Ukraine, actually, because NATO wasn't proactive enough to induct them into NATO after 2006, which, again, like I said, I don't care about technicalities of promises. I care about morality. I think that NATO should expand. I would love for the world to have a Western-style liberal democracy, of which NATO basically is a champion today, though as we can see with Turkey, there are definitely some caveats with that. And so, it's been basically, I hope, a worthwhile discussion, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.